The classroom stretched wide and tall, built for beings much larger than humans. And Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen sat at a desk that made him feel like a child attending his first day of school. Around him, cadets from across the galaxy settled into their seats with the confident ease of those who belonged. The Kreth delegates chittered among themselves, their insectoid bodies gleaming under the soft blue lights of the Valorian Military Institute. A pair of massive Thoraxians, each standing nearly 3 meters tall, discussed something in their rumbling bass voices. The elven observer from the Sylvan Concordat sat with perfect posture, her silver eyes taking in everything with quiet intensity. Marcus had been at the Institute for 3 weeks now, part of what the brass called a cultural exchange program, and what he privately called showing the flag for humanity. Earth had only joined the galactic community 15 years ago, and most species still viewed humans as newcomers barely worthy of notice. The fact that he was here at all, sitting in what many considered the finest military academy in known space, was supposed to be an honor. Most days it felt more like being the new kid at a school where everyone else had been friends for centuries. Instructor. Velthara entered through the main door, her forearms moving with practiced grace as she activated the holographic display at the front of the room. She was Valorian, one of the reptilian species known throughout the galaxy for producing the finest military tacticians. Her scales shimmered with colors that Marcus had learned to read as professional satisfaction. She enjoyed teaching, and she was very good at it. "Today we begin our study of siege warfare," Velthara announced, her voice carrying easily across the large space. This is one of the oldest forms of military engagement, and despite technological advances, the fundamental principles remain largely unchanged across all civilized species. The hologram lit up with images of fortified positions from various worlds. Marcus recognized a few from his pre-deployment briefings, though most were new to him. Each showed similar characteristics: high walls, defensive positions, clear fields of fire. Standard stuff by any measure. "A siege is fundamentally a contest of patience and resources," Velthara continued. "The defender has position and protection. The attacker has mobility and choice of engagement. Throughout galactic history, successful sieges have followed predictable patterns: establish blockade, achieve superiority in logistics, apply measured force, and eventually compel surrender or breakthrough." Cadet Sixteri, one of the Kreth nobles, raised a chitinous limb. "Instructor, the key is always overwhelming force applied with patience, correct? My people have successfully prosecuted 17 major sieges using this doctrine." Velthara's scales rippled with approval. "Correct, Cadet. The Kreth understanding of hierarchical force application is well documented. However, today, we will explore a practical scenario that may challenge conventional thinking." The hologram shifted to show a fortified enemy position on a hostile world. The parameters scrolled past: limited attacking force, no orbital support, difficult terrain. "Well-supplied defenders with technological parity. Your mission is to neutralize this position with minimal casualties and maximum speed. The defenders will not surrender through diplomacy. Reinforcements are not available. How do you proceed?" The room fell into thoughtful silence. Marcus watched as the other cadets processed the scenario. It was a good problem, carefully designed to have no easy answer. That was the point of these exercises. Zixthri spoke first. "A siege of attrition. Establish perimeter, cut supply lines, wait for defensive capabilities to degrade over 3 to 4 months, then breach at the weakest point." A Thoraxian cadet offered an alternative. "Demonstrate overwhelming force through limited bombardment. Offer honorable terms of withdrawal. Most rational defenders will accept rather than face destruction." The elven observer, Lyra Moonwhisper, suggested a more subtle approach: intelligence gathering and infiltration. Every fortress has weaknesses. Find them, exploit them, minimize casualties on both sides. Velthara acknowledged each suggestion with a gesture of her upper arms. All valid approaches within established doctrine. The Kreth method is sound if time permits. The Thoraxian suggestion assumes rational actors and shared cultural values. The Sylvan approach requires intelligence assets we specified were unavailable. Her gaze swept the room and landed on Marcus. He had been listening quietly, watching the hologram. running calculations in his head that he suspected would surprise everyone present. Staff Sergeant Chen, humanity is new to galactic warfare, but you have combat experience. How would your people approach this scenario? Marcus straightened in his seat. He had been expecting this, had actually been dreading it a little. The thing about being the only human in advanced classes was that everyone watched to see if you would embarrass yourself. He could give a conventional answer, something safe that would blend in with what the others had suggested. But Velthara had asked specifically about human approaches, and she deserved an honest answer. I need clarification on one point before I answer. Velthara's scales shifted to a color Marcus had learned meant curiosity. Proceed. Do you want ancient, modern, or classified? The room went completely silent. Marcus could feel every eye in the classroom turn toward him. Zix3's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement or derision. One of the Thoraxians made a rumbling sound deep in his chest. Velthara, S. Scales went through a rapid series of color changes that Marcus couldn't quite interpret. When she spoke, her voice carried a hint of that particular tone instructors used when they thought a student was bluffing, but wanted to see how far they would take it. That is an unusual categorization, Staff Sergeant. Please explain what you mean by these distinctions. Marcus stood, a habit from his own military training that felt appropriate even if it made him shorter than most of the seated aliens around him. He moved to the holographic controls, and Velthara gestured permission for him to use them. Ma'am, human siege warfare doctrine is extensive and varied. We have approximately 5,000 years of recorded history on the subject, developed across 7 continents in relative isolation before global communication became standard. The methodologies, technologies, and philosophical approaches vary significantly by culture, era, and technological level. Pulled up a simple timeline on the hologram, and even that basic display made several cadets lean forward. The timeline showed conflict after conflict, siege after siege, spanning millennia. It was color-coded by region and methodology, and it looked like a rainbow of violence stretching back into Earth's distant past. Ancient doctrine covers everything from Assyrian siege towers to Mongol psychological warfare. Modern doctrine includes industrial age approaches through current planetary assault protocols. Classified covers emerging technologies and theoretical applications that aren't in the public database. Zix3 made a dismissive clicking sound. Surely you exaggerate. No species develops multiple distinct siege doctrines. Efficiency demands standardization. Marcus met the Kreth cadet's compound eyes. Humans didn't have the luxury of standardization. We were too busy fighting each other to develop universal protocols. Every major culture created its own approaches based on available resources, terrain, and enemy capabilities. Odetta had gone very still, which Marcus had learned meant she was processing something unexpected. You are claiming that humanity has multiple sophisticated siege warfare traditions developed independently? Yes, ma'am. At least a dozen major traditions, with hundreds of regional variations. That is, Velthara paused, choosing her words carefully. That is highly unusual. Most species develop a single coherent military doctrine that evolves over time. Most species aren't from Earth, ma'am. Lyra spoke up, her voice thoughtful. How much time would you need to cover all of these approaches, Staff Sergeant? Marcus checked the classroom chronometer. For a comprehensive overview, I could do broad strokes of ancient methods in about 2 hours if we skipped the really obscure stuff. Modern would take another hour. Classified is harder to estimate without knowing everyone's clearance levels. The silence that followed was different from before. The other cadets weren't looking at Marcus with amusement anymore. Velthara's scales had settled into a deep blue that Marcus didn't recognize. Staff Sergeant Chen, you have the floor. Please begin with your ancient siege warfare traditions. We will allocate whatever time is necessary. Marcus nodded and turned to the hologram. This was going to be interesting. Understood, ma'am. I'll start with the Assyrians around 900 BC by Earth's calendar. They pioneered mobile siege towers and systematic wall-breaching techniques that influenced warfare for the next 1,000 years. Marcus advanced the hologram to show a massive siege tower approaching ancient walls. He could already see confusion on some of the alien faces. The scale was throwing them off, he realized. These were primitive wooden structures built by beings with no access to advanced materials, yet they functioned effectively against fortifications that would have impressed even modern observers. The Assyrians understood that. Psychological warfare was as important as physical. Assault, Marcus continued. They didn't just attack walls, they attacked the will to defend. Their siege techniques included public displays of what happened to cities that resisted. It was brutal, but effective. A Sylvan cadet raised her hand. Surely such barbarity would unite defenders rather than intimidate them? Marcus shook his head. You would think so, but historical records show otherwise. The Assyrians conquered most of the known Middle East using these methods. Fear is a powerful weapon when applied systematically. You move forward through time, pulling up images of Roman siege works. The Romans took a different approach. They were engineers first, soldiers second. When they laid siege to a position, they treated it as a construction project. The hologram showed the siege of Alesia with its double ring of fortifications. Marcus watched the alien cadets try to process what they were seeing. This is circumvallation, he explained. Julius Caesar surrounded the enemy fortress, then built a second ring of fortifications facing outward to defend against reinforcements. He was simultaneously besieging one army and preparing to be besieged by another. The entire construction took weeks and involved thousands of workers. Zixtari clicked his mandibles. That seems extraordinarily inefficient. Why not simply wait for reinforcements of your own? Because time was a weapon. The defenders inside had limited supplies. By preventing relief, Caesar guaranteed their eventual surrender. The engineering effort was significant, but it ensured victory with minimal Roman casualties. Valthera's scales shifted through several colors, and this was considered normal for Roman military operations. Standard procedure, ma'am. Romans sieged hundreds of cities using similar techniques. They wrote manuals about it. De Re Militari, by Vegetes, codified much of their siege doctrine and remained influential for over 1,000 years. Marcus pulled up another set of images. Now, the Mongols took an entirely different approach. They were nomadic cavalry specialists who traditionally avoided siege warfare. But when they encountered fortified cities, they adapted. The hologram showed Mongol siege techniques, catapults built on site, diverted rivers, biological warfare using plague corpses launched over walls. Several cadets made sounds of disgust. The Mongol siege of Baghdad in 1258 killed an estimated 500,000 people. They diverted the Tigris River, breached the walls, and spent a week systematically destroying one of the greatest cities in human history. The Grand Library, the House of Wisdom, repositories of knowledge dating back centuries, all burned. Lyra's face had gone pale. Why would they destroy knowledge? What purpose does that serve? It sends a message, Marcus said quietly. Resist, and nothing remains. Not your city, not your culture, not your history. It's total warfare in its purest form. He advanced through more examples. Byzantine Greek fire-keeping Arab sieges at bay for centuries. Crusader siege castles designed specifically for the terrain of the Holy Land. Ottoman supercannons breaching walls that had stood for 1,000 years. Chinese siege warfare that developed independently and included techniques the West wouldn't discover for centuries. With each example, the mood in the classroom grew heavier. This wasn't theoretical discussion of optimal force deployment. This was a catalog of how humans had spent thousands of years, learning to destroy each other's fortifications with ever-increasing effectiveness. The mathematics of siege. Weapons alone represents a significant body of knowledge, Marcus said. Pulling up trebuchet designs, counterweight ratios, projectile trajectories, material stress calculations. Human engineers worked these out through trial and error centuries before we developed formal physics. A Thoraxian cadet rumbled a question. These are all pre-spaceflight technologies. Surely they have no relevance to modern warfare. Marcus turned to face the large alien. The principles remain relevant. Understanding leverage, force multiplication, resource management. Psychological impact, These fundamentals don't change just because the technology improves. But you're right that these are ancient methods. He paused, glancing at Instructor Valthera. Ma'am, should I continue to modern siege warfare, or would you prefer more depth on ancient techniques? Valthera had been silent for most of Marcus's presentation. Her scales constantly shifting through colors he was still learning to read. When she spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. Staff Sergeant, I confess, I am somewhat disturbed by the variety and sophistication of pre-industrial siege warfare your species developed. However, I am also professionally intrigued. These are indeed ancient techniques, developed before spaceflight, before global communication, before modern ethics. She gestured at the hologram still showing a massive trebuchet. You mentioned that human cultures developed these techniques independently while fighting each other. Can you elaborate on that? Marcus nodded. Earth's geography, isolated populations for most of human history, oceans, mountains, deserts, they all created barriers that prevented cultural exchange. So when the Chinese developed siege techniques, the Europeans didn't know about them, and vice versa. Each culture faced similar problems and solved them independently. That explains the variety, Lyra said softly, but not the intensity. Why did humans devote so much effort to siege warfare specifically? It was a good question, and Marcus had to think about how to answer it. Because cities represented civilization. Controlling cities meant controlling population, resources, trade routes, and walls represented security. The tension between those two factors, the importance of cities and the defenses protecting them, drove constant innovation. He pulled up a map of Earth showing the locations of major historical sieges. The density of markers was staggering. We were at war with ourselves for most of recorded history. Not constantly, not everywhere, but frequently enough that military innovation never stopped. Every generation learned from the last, added improvements, developed new techniques. That sounds exhausting, one of the Sylvan cadets murmured. It was, Marcus agreed. It still is, in a way. Even now, human military academies study these ancient sieges because the lessons remain valid. Valthera stood and walked to the hologram, examining the Earth map with its countless siege markers. This level of conflict should have destroyed your species or at least severely limited development. It almost did, several times. But it also drove innovation. Military necessity funded engineering advances, medical developments, logistical systems. Many of our greatest peacetime technologies started as military projects. The instructor turned to face Marcus directly. You said these are ancient techniques, unsuited for modern warfare? I said you might consider them primitive, ma'am. But the fundamentals translate. Resource management, force multiplication, psychological operations, combined arms coordination. Humans learned all of these through centuries of siege warfare. X3 spoke up, his tone less dismissive than before. You keep saying humans learned through experience. You mean through failure? Marcus met the Kreth cadet's eyes. Mostly through failure, yes. Every technique I've shown you was developed because something else didn't work. Siege towers because ladders were too vulnerable. Circumvallation because relief forces broke standard blockades. Greek fire because conventional weapons couldn't stop naval assaults. Humans are very good at learning from mistakes. Because you made so many of them, Zix3 observed. Because we survived making them, Marcus corrected. That's the difference. Valthera returned to her position at the front of the classroom. Her scales had settled into a dark green that Marcus interpreted as serious contemplation. Staff Sergeant Chen, you mentioned that these ancient techniques represent only one category of human siege warfare knowledge. Yes, ma'am. And modern techniques are significantly different? Yes, ma'am. The Industrial Revolution changed everything. Mechanization, explosive chemistry, aerial bombardment, electronic warfare. The fundamental goals remained the same: breach fortifications, neutralize defenders, control positions, but the methods evolved dramatically. Valthara's scales shifted again. I want to say that such evolution is normal, that all species develop more sophisticated warfare techniques as technology advances, Marcus prompted. But the sheer variety and sophistication of your pre-industrial techniques suggests that human innovation in siege warfare didn't start with modern technology. It merely accelerated. Marcus said nothing. It was an accurate assessment. Very well, Valthera said after a long pause. We will take a brief recess. When we return, Staff Sergeant Chen will continue with modern human siege warfare doctrine. All cadets are to use this time to review the ancient techniques discussed and prepare questions. The cadets stood and began filing out. Marcus noticed that several of them glanced at him differently than before. Not with dismissal or amusement, but with something that looked like wary respite. The classroom felt different when the cadets returned from recess, Marcus noticed. The casual atmosphere from earlier had been replaced by something more tense, more watchful. Word had apparently spread during the break about the humans' presentation on ancient siege warfare. Several cadets who had been absent from the first session now occupied seats in the back. Their attention focused intently on Marcus. Instructor Valthera called the class to order with a gesture of her upper arms. We will now continue with Staff Sergeant Chen's overview of human siege warfare. Staff Sergeant, you have indicated that modern techniques differ significantly from ancient methods. Please proceed. Marcus activated the holographic display and pulled up a timeline starting in the early 1800s. The Industrial Revolution changed warfare fundamentally. When humans gained the ability to mass-produce weapons, ammunition, and equipment, siege warfare evolved from months-long affairs into faster, more destructive engagements. The first image showed artillery batteries arranged in precise geometric patterns. The siege of Vicksburg during the American Civil War demonstrated industrial-age siege tactics. Artillery bombardment became continuous rather than intermittent. Trench networks allowed attackers to advance while under cover. The siege lasted 47 days and involved over 220 cannons firing constantly. Ah! Kreth Cadet raised a limb. Continuous bombardment seems wasteful of ammunition. Humans had learned to manufacture ammunition faster than it could be expended. The calculation changed from conserving resources to applying maximum pressure. Marcus advanced the timeline to World War I. The hologram displayed the horror of Verdun, trenches stretching for kilometers. Artillery craters overlapping until the landscape became unrecognizable. Casualty figures that made several cadets lean forward as if they had misread the numbers. Verdun was a siege that lasted 10 months. The French and Germans fired approximately 40 million artillery shells at each other. Casualty estimates ranged from 700,000 to over 1 million soldiers killed or wounded. The classroom was completely silent. Zix-3's mandibles had stopped moving. Even the massive Thoraxians sat utterly still. I apologize, a Sylvan cadet said quietly. There must be a translation error. Did you say 1 million casualties? That's the estimate, yes. The battle turned a 30-kilometer section of northeastern France into a moonscape. Some areas still can't be safely inhabited due to unexploded ordnance and chemical contamination. Valthara scales had gone a pale color Marcus had never seen before. Staff Sergeant, those numbers represent a significant portion of Earth's population at that time. Yes, ma'am. World War I killed approximately 20 million people total. It was called the Great War because humans genuinely believed nothing could ever be worse. And was it? Lyra asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. Marcus pulled up images from World War II. 20 years later, World War II killed an estimated 70 to 85 million people. Siege warfare evolved again. Stalingrad demonstrated modern urban siege tactics. The hologram showed the ruined city, building by building fighting, soldiers using rubble as cover and tunneling through walls to avoid streets. The battle lasted 5 months. Casualty estimates vary, but approximately 2 million people died, soldiers and civilians combined. The city was fought for literally room by room. Why? The question came from a Thoraxian cadet, his deep voice carrying genuine confusion. Why continue such destruction? Surely either side could have withdrawn, saved their forces, fought elsewhere? Strategic value and symbolic importance. Stalingrad was a major industrial center and transportation hub. It also bore the Soviet leader's name. Neither side could afford to lose, so neither side retreated. Marcus walked them through the tactics, using snipers to control movement, small unit infiltration, combined arms in urban terrain, the use of flamethrowers and explosive charges to clear fortified buildings. Each innovation had been purchased with blood, learned through trial and error against an enemy equally determined to learn and adapt. The Germans developed specialized assault groups for urban fighting. The Soviets learned to fight at night and in close quarters where German technological advantages mattered less. Both sides evolved tactics specifically for that environment. He showed them Leningrad besieged for 872 days. He showed them the siege of Budapest, the Battle of Berlin, the systematic reduction of Japanese island fortifications. Each example demonstrated some new technique, some new application of firepower or maneuver or combined arms coordination. Zixtari spoke up. His voice carried an edge that hadn't been there before. This is not warfare. This is mutual slaughter without honor or reason. Marcus turned to face the Kreth cadet. You're correct that it's not honorable. War isn't honorable, cadet. War is a failure of civilization that we prosecute with maximum effectiveness to minimize its duration. The faster we can win, the faster the killing stops. But the cost of losing, is higher. Every human who fought in these sieges understood that their homes, their families, their entire way of life depended on victory. When the stakes are that high, you use every tool available. Velthera stood and moved to the holographic display. She studied the images of Stalingrad's ruins for a long moment. Staff Sergeant, I need to understand something. These tactics you're describing, building, fighting, flamethrowers, explosive charges used at close range, this is accepted doctrine in human military training? Yes, ma'am. Every human Marine receives basic urban warfare training. Specialized units receive significantly more. What? And you have used these techniques? Marcus met her gaze. I've been deployed to 3 urban combat zones. Yes, ma'am. I've used these techniques. The classroom had gone very quiet again. Marcus realized that until this moment, the other cadets had been processing his presentation as history, as theoretical discussion of ancient conflicts. Now they were looking at him and seeing someone who had personally participated in the kind of fighting he was describing. Lyra broke the silence. Staff Sergeant, you mentioned that World War II ended in 1945 by Earth's calendar. That was over 80 years ago. Surely human warfare has evolved since then to be less. She paused, searching for the right word. Destructive. Marcus advanced the timeline to show more recent conflicts. Technology has improved. Precision weapons allow more selective targeting. But the fundamentals of siege warfare remain. The siege of Sarajevo in the 1990s lasted nearly 4 years. Modern snipers, artillery, and psychological operations against a civilian population. He showed them Grozny, Fallujah, Mosul, and other urban battles from recent decades. In each case, humans had taken the lessons from earlier sieges and applied them with newer technology. Drones for reconnaissance, guided munitions for precision strikes, electronic warfare to disrupt enemy communications, information operations to undermine enemy morale. You asked if warfare has evolved to be less destructive? The answer is yes and no. We can be more precise when we choose to be. But when the situation requires it, humans can still conduct total warfare with industrial efficiency. A cadet Marcus didn't recognize spoke up from the back. I find it difficult to believe that a species capable of such violence could also achieve the technological and social development necessary for spaceflight. The two seem fundamentally incompatible. Marcus nodded slowly. You would think so, but human technological development was often driven by military necessity. Rockets developed from missile programs, computers from artillery calculations, the internet from military communication networks, nuclear power from weapons research. We reached for the stars using tools we originally built to kill each other. Althera returned to her position at the front of the room. Her scales were still that pale color, and Marcus was beginning to think it indicated some form of shock. Staff Sergeant Chen, I believe we need another recess. These modern techniques are, she paused, more disturbing than I had anticipated. Marcus deactivated the hologram. Understood, ma'am. As the cadets filed out, Marcus noticed they gave him more space than before. Not hostile exactly, but wary. Like they were reassessing what a human was capable of. Several clustered together in the hallway, their voices carrying back into the classroom in a mix of languages and tones that all conveyed the same basic sentiment: shock and unease. Valthara remained behind. "Staff Sergeant, may I speak candidly?" "Of course, ma'am. I am beginning to understand why the Galactic Council debated humanity's admission so extensively. Your species has a capacity for violence that is," she searched for words, "unprecedented in my experience." Marcus stood at parade rest. "Ma'am, I would argue that we have a capacity for survival. The violence is a tool we developed because we needed it. And do you still need it? I hope not. But we prepare as if we might." Valthara's scales shifted through several colors. "You mentioned classified techniques. I confess I am both curious and apprehensive about what could possibly be worse than what you've already described." "It's different. Everything I've shown you so far is historical techniques we developed fighting each other. The classified material is theoretical and speculative, designed for scenarios we haven't encountered yet. Scenarios involving other species." The classroom felt smaller when everyone returned, though the same number of cadets occupied their seats. Several had clearly used the break to research human military history, their expressions showing the results of that investigation. 3 cadets had been asked to leave based on security clearance limitations, and their absence created gaps that made the remaining students seem more isolated. Instructor Valthara stood at the front of the room with her scales set in a dark, determined blue. "Before we proceed, I want to establish ground rules. Staff Sergeant Chen has received authorization to present classified human military doctrine. What you are about to hear is not public knowledge and falls under Institute confidentiality protocols. Nothing discussed in this session may be shared outside this classroom without proper authorization." She paused, letting that sink in. "Furthermore, I want everyone to remember that we are here to learn, not to judge. Every species in this room has military capabilities they would prefer to keep private. The Staff Sergeant is being unusually forthcoming about human doctrine as a gesture of trust and educational value. We will respond with professional respect." Marcus stood and activated the holographic display. His hands moved across the controls with practiced efficiency, calling up a series of documents marked with human military classification symbols. What I've shown you so far represents historical human siege warfare techniques we developed and employed against each other. What I'm about to present represents theoretical and developing doctrine for scenarios humanity hasn't yet encountered. First hologram showed a planetary body with orbital trajectories calculated around it. Kinetic bombardment, sometimes called rods from God in human military slang. The concept is simple. Position tungsten rods in orbit, then drop them on fortified positions. No explosives needed. The kinetic energy from orbital velocity is sufficient to penetrate any known fortification and deliver explosive force equivalent to tactical nuclear weapons. A Sylvan cadet raised her hand. But this is simply orbital bombardment. Most spacefaring species have similar capabilities. The difference is in the application, Marcus explained. Human doctrine treats kinetic bombardment not as a strategic weapon, but as a tactical siege tool. We've calculated deployment protocols for precision strikes on fortified positions while minimizing collateral damage. The rods can be as small as a few centimeters in diameter for bunker penetration or several meters for fortress destruction. He pulled up technical specifications that made several cadets lean forward. The calculations covered atmospheric entry angles, terminal velocity optimization, and target penetration based on different planetary gravities and atmospheric densities. We've run simulations for 43 different planetary environments currently inhabited by galactic species. The protocols are adapted for each. Zix3's mandibles clicked rapidly. You have calculated how to conduct kinetic bombardment on our worlds? On every world with a significant population in the galactic community, yes. The silence that followed was heavy. Marcus continued. Neutron weapon deployment for fortification neutralization represents another option. These are nuclear weapons designed to maximize radiation and minimize blast effect. They can kill defenders inside a fortification while leaving the structure largely intact. A Thoraxian rumbled a question. Why would you want to preserve structures you've just attacked? Because sometimes you want to occupy the position afterward. Destroying fortifications is easy. Taking them intact requires more precision. Marcus pulled up another set of documents. Emerging technologies include nanite-based siege systems, self-replicating machines that can infiltrate fortifications and disable systems from within. Current human research has produced prototypes, though deployment doctrine is still theoretical. He watched the alien faces around him process this. The concept of microscopic machines that could penetrate any defense and dismantle it from the inside clearly disturbed them. Singularity containment breach tactics are more theoretical. If an enemy is using contained singularities for power generation, which several species do human, doctrine includes protocols for deliberately destabilizing those containment fields. Lyra's face had gone pale. That would destroy everything within kilometers. You're talking about turning an enemy's power source into a weapon against them. Yes, it's a last resort option, but it's been calculated and simulated. Marcus advanced to the next section. Mimetic warfare and information siege protocols represent non-kinetic approaches. These involve identifying psychological and cultural vulnerabilities in enemy populations and exploiting them to undermine defensive morale. He pulled up a complex diagram showing information flow analysis. Human intelligence services have developed psychological profiles for every known sapient species. We've identified cultural values, social structures, communication patterns, and decision-making processes. In a siege situation, this information can be weaponized. Velthara's scales had gone through several color changes Marcus couldn't interpret. Weaponized how, precisely? By crafting messages designed to create doubt, fear, or internal conflict within the defending population. For example, if a species has strong hierarchical loyalty structures, you introduce information suggesting leadership, incompetence, or betrayal. If a species values honor above survival, you create situations where honorable action leads to tactical disadvantage. Marcus pulled up specific examples. For Kreth, defensive positions, human doctrine suggests exploiting hierarchical decision-making delays by forcing rapid tactical changes. The defenders can't adapt too quickly. For Thoraxian fortifications, it would target the cultural emphasis on single combat by using massed automated systems they would consider dishonorable. For Sylvan positions, stop, Lyra said quietly. Please stop. Marcus paused. Ma'am, the elven cadet stood slowly. You have calculated how to psychologically break every species in this room. That's correct. You said these are theoretical protocols. Does that mean they haven't been tested? Marcus chose his words carefully. They haven't been used against galactic species. The psychological warfare principles have been tested extensively in human conflicts. Zixtheri spoke up, his voice carrying less arrogance than before. When you say tested, you mean used against other humans. Yes, psychological operations have been part of human warfare for thousands of years. We understand how to break morale because we've done it to ourselves repeatedly. Cadet Marcus didn't know well made a choking sound. What kind of species develops weapons specifically designed to destroy their own people's will to fight? A species that takes warfare seriously, Marcus replied. Every technique I'm describing exists because humans fought enemies who were just as intelligent, adaptable, and determined as we were. We couldn't afford to leave any potential advantage unexplored. Velthara gestured for Marcus to continue. Her scales had settled into a color he finally recognized, grim professional acceptance. Biological siege adaptation represents perhaps the most sensitive area of human siege doctrine. Human biology is significantly different from most galactic species. We've evolved on what the galactic community classifies as a Class 12 death world. Our environmental tolerances, disease resistance, and physical capabilities reflect that. He pulled up comparative biological data. Human siege doctrine includes protocols for exploiting biological differences. For example, many species have much narrower temperature tolerance ranges than humans. A siege conducted in environmental extremes would favor human forces. Similarly, humans have unusually robust immune systems by galactic standards. Biological agents that would incapacitate other species might not affect human troops. You're talking about biological warfare, a Sylvan cadet said flatly. I'm talking about understanding biological differences and how they affect siege scenarios. If humans needed to assault a Kreth fortification in high-temperature environments, we could do so with less environmental support than Kreth defenders would require. That's not a weapon, it's an advantage based on adaptation. Marcus pulled up one final set of documents. Decision loop analysis represents the most sophisticated aspect of human siege doctrine. Humans are a relatively short-lived species by galactic standards. We make decisions faster because we have less time to make them. Our military decision-making processes operate on timescales that many longer-lived species find uncomfortable. He showed comparative analysis of decision-making speeds across species. In a dynamic siege situation, the ability to observe, decide, and act faster than your opponent creates cascading advantages. Human doctrine explicitly targets enemy decision-making processes to create overload conditions. A Thoraxian cadet rumbled thoughtfully. You are describing warfare as a cognitive competition. All warfare is cognitive competition. Siege warfare especially so. The defender has advantages of position and preparation. The attacker's advantage is flexibility and initiative. Speed of decision-making amplifies initiative. Valthera moved to stand beside the holographic display. Staff Sergeant Chen, you have presented a comprehensive overview of human siege capabilities that is frankly disturbing in its scope and sophistication. I have one critical question. Marcus stood at attention. Ma'am. The classroom was empty now, except for Marcus and instructor Valthera. The holographic displays had been deactivated. The chairs where cadets had sat just hours ago were vacant, and the space felt larger somehow in the silence. Valthera hadn't dismissed Marcus after the other students left. Instead, she stood by the window overlooking the Institute's training grounds. Her scales cycling through colors Marcus had learned meant deep contemplation. Staff Sergeant Chen. I have been teaching military theory at this institute for 23 years, Valthera said without turning from the window. I have instructed officers from 47 different species. I have studied warfare across hundreds of cultures and thousands of years of galactic history. She turned to face him then, and her scales had settled into a color Marcus had never seen before, something between gray and silver. And in all that time, I have never encountered a species like humanity. Marcus remained at parade rest. Ma'am, I'm not sure if that's a compliment or a concern. There am I, Valthera admitted. She moved to one of the student desks and sat, a gesture of informality that surprised Marcus. It made her seem less like an instructor and more like someone genuinely trying to understand. Help me comprehend something, Staff Sergeant. The siege warfare doctrine you've presented today, ancient through Speta, classified represents a level of preparation and sophistication that seems excessive for any rational species. Why? Marcus thought carefully before responding. May I speak candidly, ma'am? Please do. Humans come from a death world. That's not propaganda or exaggeration. Earth is legitimately more hostile than most planets that produce sapient life. We evolved competing with megafauna that could kill us easily, diseases that decimated populations, climate extremes that forced constant adaptation, and natural disasters that destroyed entire civilizations. He moved to the window beside Valthera, looking out at the carefully manicured training grounds where cadets from peaceful worlds learned sanitized versions of warfare. Every human culture developed independently on different continents, separated by oceans we couldn't cross for thousands of years. We didn't have the luxury of a unified planetary development like most species. We were isolated tribes, then city-states, then nations, all competing for limited resources on a world that was actively trying to kill us. Thara's scales rippled. So you fought each other because you were separated? We fought each other because we didn't know how not to. When two human cultures met, they usually went to war eventually. Not because we were evil or inherently violent, but because each side saw the other as a potential threat to survival. And on Earth, threats to survival were everywhere. Marcus pulled up a hologram of Earth on his personal device, showing the planet's climate zones, tectonic plate boundaries, and historical natural disaster locations. Hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, ice ages, droughts, floods. Earth throws everything at its inhabitants. Human civilizations learned early that survival required preparation for worst-case scenarios. You applied that lesson to warfare. You applied it to everything: medicine, engineering, agriculture, social organization, and yes, warfare. When you grow up on a world where unprepared populations die, you learn to prepare obsessively. Valthera stood and walked to the hologram, examining the displayed data. Other species evolved on challenging worlds and didn't develop such. She searched for the word. Comprehensive warfare doctrine. Did they develop in isolation from each other? Marcus asked. Most spacefaring species I've studied had relatively unified planetary development. One or two major landmasses, easy ocean travel, rapid cultural exchange. They developed space travel as a species rather than as competing nations. And humanity? We reached space because the United States and Soviet Union were competing to see who could build better missiles. Our first satellites were designed to prove we could hit each other from orbit. We walked on our moon to demonstrate technological superiority. We built space stations to establish military presence. Everything we accomplished in space for the first 50 years was driven by military competition. Valthara's scales shifted to a darker color that seems deeply dysfunctional. It almost destroyed us several times. Nuclear weapons nearly ended human civilization before we even left our own planet. But we survived because we learned. Learned what? Marcus turned to face her directly. That preparing for the worst doesn't mean you want the worst to happen. That having overwhelming capability doesn't require using it. That the best victory is the one you never have to fight for, because everyone knows you could win if you had to. Valthara returned to her desk and sat again. Her scales cycling through colors Marcus couldn't read. The other species in the galactic community, most of them developed warfare as a tool of last resort. They view military force as a regrettable necessity, something to be used sparingly and with great consideration. Humans view it the same way, do you? Because the siege warfare doctrine you presented suggests a species that has thought about warfare in extraordinary detail. We've thought about it in detail precisely because we view it as a last resort, Marcus said. If you're going to use violence only when absolutely necessary, you want to make sure it works when you need it. Half measures in warfare just prolong suffering. If we fight to win quickly and decisively, because that minimizes casualties on all sides. That's a very clinical way to discuss killing. Do you prefer I be emotional about it? Ma'am, I've seen combat. I've lost friends. I know what warfare costs. Being clinical isn't callousness. It's learned professionalism. If I let emotion drive tactical decisions, people die who didn't need to. And the classified protocols you described, the preparations for fighting species you've never engaged. Marcus sat down across from Valthera, matching her informal posture. Those exist because humans are very good at learning from mistakes, and we've made enough mistakes to learn some hard lessons. One of those lessons is that wishful thinking kills people. We don't assume peace will last just because we want it to. We prepare for conflict while working for peace. Deterrence, Valthera said, echoing Marcus's earlier statement. Yes, ma'am. Every species in the galactic community knows that humans have extensive military capabilities now. They know we've prepared for multiple scenarios. That knowledge itself prevents conflict, because nobody wants to test whether our preparations would actually work. Valthara was quiet for a long moment. You realize that some species will view humanity's preparations as aggressive rather than defensive? Some already do. We can't control how others interpret our actions. We can only control our actual behavior. Humans have been part of the galactic community for 15 years and haven't initiated a single military conflict. Our record speaks for itself. But you're prepared too. We're prepared to defend ourselves and our allies if necessary. Yes. Valthara stood and moved to the holographic display controls, pulling up the images Marcus had shown earlier: ancient siege towers, modern urban warfare, classified protocols. Looking at all of this together, I see a pattern. Human warfare isn't about conquest or glory. It's about survival. That's exactly right. Every technique you described, from ancient to classified, is built on the assumption that failure means extinction. Marcus nodded. Because for most of human history, that was true. Lose a war, and your culture disappeared. Your people were enslaved or killed. Your cities were destroyed. Your history was erased. Humans fought like survival was always at stake because it usually was. And now, humanity is spacefaring, technologically advanced, part of a larger galactic community. Do you still fight like extinction is the alternative? We prepare like it might be. There's a difference between paranoia and prudent planning. Paranoia sees threats everywhere and strikes preemptively. Prudent planning identifies potential threats and prepares responses without assuming those threats will materialize. Valthara's scales shifted to a lighter color. That's a fine distinction. It's an important one. Paranoid species start wars. Prepared species prevent them. She deactivated the hologram and turned to face Marcus fully. I'm going to file my report with the Galactic Council. I'm going to tell them that humanity represents a unique challenge to standard galactic military theory. You don't fit our models for how species approach warfare.
I understand, ma'am.
But I'm also going to recommend that humanity be valued as potential allies rather than potential threats. A species that prepares this thoroughly for conflict while actively pursuing peace is exactly what the galaxy needs. Marcus felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. Thank you, ma'am. Don't thank me yet. There will be species that disagree with my assessment. Some will view human military capability as inherently threatening, regardless of your stated intentions. We'll address those concerns through continued peaceful engagement and transparent communication. Valthera made a sound that Marcus had learned was the Valorian equivalent of a laugh. You make it sound simple.